In times past, mental illness was misunderstood as a mark of malevolence, frailty, or even sin. Those affected were often met with remedies as cruel as isolation, barbaric torture, or mutilation. The torment of their conditions was only exacerbated by the societal stigma and deafening silence that enveloped them. As if enduring these illnesses wasn't distressing enough, the prescribed treatments often brought further agony and horror. Welcome to Bizarre History, where today we journey into the dark annals of mental illness treatments, uncovering the haunting tales of asylums and their grave abuses. Asylums, the institutions that were supposed to care for the mentally ill, have a long and disturbing history of mistreatment and abuse. Their origins can be traced back to the mid-1700s when they became places of isolation and punishment for those who did not conform to the norms of society. As Jeffrey A. Lieberman writes in Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, the purpose of the earliest mental institutions was neither treatment nor cure, but rather the enforced segregation of inmates from society. The mentally ill were seen as deviants or sinners who deserved to suffer. The horrors of asylum life were exposed by journalist Nellie Bly, who infiltrated the Blackwell Island Insane Asylum in New York in 1887. She witnessed the brutal and inhumane conditions that the patients endured, such as beatings, choking, and freezing baths. One patient told her, "For crying, the nurse beat me with a broom handle and jumped on me. Then they tied my hands and feet, throwing a sheet over my head, twisted it so tightly around my throat so I could not scream, and thus put me in a bathtub filled with cold water. They held me under until I gave up every hope and became senseless." Asylums also used various forms of torture disguised as treatments, such as hydrotherapy and mechanical restraints. Patients were submerged in water, wrapped in wet sheets, or sprayed with cold showers to calm them down. They were also restrained with straitjackets, chains, or leather straps for long periods of time. These methods were not meant to protect the patients, but to control the overcrowded facilities. As psychiatry emerged as a new branch of medicine, asylums became the testing grounds for experimental treatments. However, instead of improving the lives of the mentally ill, they often inflicted more harm and suffering. People who had physical diseases often received compassion and support from others, but those who had mental disorders faced a different fate in the 1800s. They were treated harshly and unfairly by the medical profession, which had a narrow and biased view of the causes of mental illness. According to the doctors of that time, there were only two possible explanations for why someone would have a mental disorder. Either they were under the influence of an evil spirit that had taken over their mind, or they had committed some moral sin that had corrupted their soul. The doctors believed that the only way to cure these conditions was to use religious and moral interventions. The treatments that the doctors prescribed for the mentally ill were often cruel and ineffective. They would lock them up in hospitals or asylums, isolate them from society, and try to persuade them to change their immoral beliefs. These methods did not help the patients, but only added to their suffering and stigma. Psychiatry is the medical specialty that deals with mental disorders and their treatment. However, in the past, psychiatrists often used methods that were cruel, ineffective, and sometimes deadly. One of the pioneers of American psychiatry was Benjamin Rush, who rejected the idea that insanity was caused by demons. However, he still believed that mental illness was due to an imbalance of bodily fluids. To restore this balance, he subjected his patients to harsh treatments such as bleeding, vomiting, blistering, and purging. Another influential psychiatrist was Henry Cotton, who ran the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey from 1907 to 1930. He thought that mental illness was caused by infections in various parts of the body. He started by extracting rotten teeth from his patients, hoping to eliminate the source of infection. When this failed, he moved on to removing tonsils, stomachs, intestines, appendices, gallbladders, thyroid glands, and colons. These surgeries often resulted in death or disability for the patients. A third example of a controversial psychiatric treatment was the fever therapy developed developed by Julius Wagner Jauregg. He discovered that high fevers could improve the symptoms of syphilis, a disease that could affect the brain and cause dementia. He decided to try this therapy on patients with schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder. He injected them with blood infected with malaria, a disease that causes high fevers. This method was so popular that Wagner Jauregg won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1927, the first for psychiatry. However, fever therapy also had a high risk of death. About 15% of the patients who received it died from malaria or its complications. These are some examples of how early psychiatric treatments were based on misguided theories and harmful practices. Fortunately, modern psychiatry has advanced significantly and relies on more humane and effective methods. In the early 20th century, psychiatrists were desperate to find effective treatments for mental disorders such as schizophrenia and depression. They experimented with various methods of inducing seizures and comas in their patients, hoping to shock their brains into normalcy. These methods, known as shock therapies, were based on dubious theories and often caused more harm than good. One of the first shock therapies was insulin shock therapy, introduced by Manfred Sakel, a German neurologist who immigrated to the United States. He injected patients with high doses of insulin, which lowered their blood sugar levels and triggered convulsions and coma. After several hours, the patients would be revived, supposedly cured of their madness. This procedure was repeated daily for months, sometimes up to 60 times per patient. However, insulin shock therapy was very risky and resulted in memory loss. Despite its questionable effectiveness, it became widely used in American asylums by 1941. Another shock therapy that followed was metrazol shock therapy, developed by Laszlo von Meduna, a Hungarian physician who believed that epilepsy and schizophrenia were incompatible. He used metrazol, a drug that induced violent seizures in patients, to shock their brains out of mental illness. This therapy was also physically damaging and terrifying for the patients. Many of them suffered spinal fractures due to the force of the convulsions. One patient described the experience as feeling like dying. Metrazol shock therapy also caused retrograde amnesia in many cases. Fortunately, metrazol shock therapy was discontinued in the 1950s, and the FDA banned the drug in 1982. It was replaced by electroconvulsive shock therapy, ECT, which used electric currents to stimulate the brain. In the 1800s, many women suffered from mental or physical problems that were not taken seriously by the medical profession. They were often labeled as hysterical, a term that could mean anything from fatigue and nausea to anxiety and depression. The diagnosis was vague and unscientific, but it was used to dismiss and invalidate women's experiences and needs. The treatments that were offered to women with hysteria were not effective or respectful. One of the most common remedies was massage, which was supposed to calm the nerves and restore the balance of the body. However, some doctors and patients also used mechanical vibrators, which were originally invented as medical devices to stimulate the muscles in the back and shoulders. These devices were later marketed as sex toys, revealing the sexual nature of some of the treatments for hysteria. Lobotomies were a surgical procedure that aimed to treat mental disorders by cutting off parts of the brain. They were first performed by doctors in other countries, but they became popular in the United States after Walter Freeman, a neurologist, started experimenting with them in the 1940s. He believed that mental illness was caused by faulty connections in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls emotions, planning, and personality. He thought that by damaging those connections, he could eliminate the symptoms of mental illness. However, lobotomies had serious and irreversible consequences. They not only affected the patient's behaviors, but also their memories and personalities. Freeman himself acknowledged that lobotomies made the patient lose some of their original traits and qualities. Baron Lerner, a medical historian and professor at NYU Langone Medical Center in New York, explained to Live Science that lobotomies altered the neurological neurological connections that defined the patient's behaviors. Despite the negative effects, lobotomies were widely performed on thousands of patients in the United States, mostly in asylums, until Freeman's death in 1972. According to DeYoung, a historian of psychiatry, lobotomies became less common in the 1970s as medication became the dominant form of treatment for mental health. In the ancient times, a Greek doctor named Claudius Galen had a strange idea about the cause of diseases. He thought that the body had 4 substances, called humors, that had to be in balance for a person to be healthy. If the humors were out of balance, he believed that the person would get sick, either physically or mentally. His solution was to remove some of the excess humors from the body by making the person bleed, vomit, or purge. This idea was forgotten for many centuries until an English doctor named Thomas Willis rediscovered it in the 1600s. He was interested in treating mental illnesses, and he thought that Galen's method could work for his patients. He began applying bloodletting and purging to the mentally ill, hoping to restore their humoral balance. His practice became very popular, and soon other doctors started using it for all kinds of diseases. However, this cure was often more harmful than helpful, and it caused many people to suffer and die. For a long time, the mentally ill were treated with harsh and harmful drugs that only served to calm them down and make them easier to handle in the crowded and chaotic asylums. Since the mid-1800s, doctors used substances like opium, morphine, and mercury, which had serious side effects and could cause addiction or poisoning. Some drugs, such as barbiturates and chloral hydrate, induced a deep sleep that was supposed to cure their insanity, but sometimes led to more psychotic symptoms. However, everything changed when thorazine was discovered in the 1950s. This drug was a game changer for psychiatry as it was much safer and more effective than the previous ones. It could reduce the symptoms of severe mental disorders such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorders without causing too much sedation or addiction. Thorazine opened the door for other similar drugs such as Risperdal, Zyprexa, Abilify, and Seroquel, which also helped millions of mental patients to live better lives. These drugs were the start of a new era for psychiatric treatment, one that focused on healing rather than suppressing. If you want more of history's long-held secrets and darkest confessions, hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. From us at Bizarre History, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.